What if I told you the biggest winner of World War III isn't even officially in the war? While superpowers burn alliances and economies collapse, one country is making moves so precise, so calculated, the world hasn't even noticed. That country is India. This is the story of how India is quietly winning World War III. But to understand how, we need to go back to where it all began, February 28th, 2026. The world woke up to something nobody was fully prepared for. The United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, over 900 strikes, across Iran in 12 hours. Reporters on the ground were telling people to stay inside. Bombs were falling everywhere. More than 200 people were dead within hours. And this was just the beginning, because Iran was never going to stay silent. Within hours of the first strikes, the response came. Missiles and drones began hitting targets across the region. Israel was hit. The UAE was hit. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Jordan, Iraq, Oman. In a matter of days, what began as a two-country military operation had exploded into a region-wide war. And within 2 weeks, that region-wide war was beginning to look like something the world had not seen since 1945. The International Monetary Fund issued a warning about global economic panic. Stock markets crashed across the world. Japan, South Korea, London, Europe, all of them bleeding. Qatar made a decision that sent shockwaves through the global energy system, halting 17% of the world's liquefied natural gas supply overnight. Just like that. Gone. Gas facilities were damaged. Oil prices began climbing at a rate that economists were calling catastrophic. Pakistan's already fragile economy began collapsing under the pressure. Fuel prices spiked in 85 countries in a single night. Africa was staring down the barrel of food shortages. Southeast Asia was watching its supply chains fracture in real time. Military forces were mobilizing across the Middle East. The world was in full panic mode. And then there was India, standing completely still, completely steady, petrol prices unchanged, markets holding stable relative to everything happening around them, an economy not collapsing but continuing to move. How? How does a country that was written off for so long, a country that was called a developing nation, a third world economy, a place the global north constantly patronized and underestimated, how is that country the one standing firm while everyone else is shaking? The answer is not luck. It was never luck. The answer is architecture. Patient, deliberate, extraordinary architecture. Built across 4 pillars that took India decades to construct while the world was watching other things. Those 4 pillars are geography, resources, strategy, and relationships. And across every single one of them, India is not just surviving this war. India is winning it. Before we talk about how India is winning, we need to talk about something that most people fundamentally misunderstand. We need to talk about what geopolitics actually is. Most people think it is about good and evil, about heroes and villains, about democracy versus authoritarianism or freedom versus oppression. They watch the news and they cheer for the side they believe in and they boo the side they oppose. But that is not geopolitics. That is storytelling. Geopolitics is about power. That is it. Nothing more. Nothing less. It is about acquiring it, protecting it, and using it to shape the world in your favor. That is how it has always worked. From the ancient empires to the colonial era to the Cold War to right now, power is the only currency that matters. And power as a nation comes from 4 things. The first is geography. Where you are on the map is not a choice, but it is the single biggest advantage or disadvantage a nation can ever have. The United States sits between 2 enormous oceans. A full-scale ground invasion of America is not just difficult, it is practically impossible. That geographic reality alone means the United States almost never has to think about defending its own borders. Switzerland, locked inside steep mountain ranges, watched 2 world wars tear Europe apart and survived both of them because tanks cannot easily move through the Alps. Geography protects, geography enables, and geography cannot be taken away. The second is resources. Whatever you have that someone else needs, that is your leverage. The Middle East has no particularly dominant history of military technology or industrial innovation by global standards, but it has oil, enormous quantities of oil. And with that single resource, a collection of desert nations can shake the foundations of the entire global economy whenever they choose. China sits on vast deposits of rare earth minerals that go inside every smartphone, every electric vehicle battery, and every modern missile guidance system. That resource alone gives China control over approximately 70% of the global supply of something that every major military and every major technology company on Earth desperately needs. The third is strategy, knowing which pressure point to press and precisely when to press it. Iran is not a military superpower. Its armed forces cannot match America in a straight fight. Its economy has been strangled by sanctions for years. And yet on the day this war began, one Iranian decision changed everything. The closing of the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that is only 33 kilometers wide, sent global oil prices climbing 65% in 2 weeks. It crashed stock markets from Tokyo to London. It forced every navy in the world to scramble and rethink. 33 kilometers of water. That is the power of strategy. The fourth is relationships. Your allies, your partners, your network of trust built over years and decades of consistent behavior. After the Second World War, the United States did not just win militarily. It built NATO. It built the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. America wrote the rules of the entire global order. And for decades, every other nation played by those rules because they had no other choice. That is what relationship capital looks like when it reaches its highest form. Now, take those four pillars and hold them in your mind, because what India has done across each of them is nothing short of extraordinary. Let us start with geography, because India's geographic position is, to put it plainly, almost unfairly good. Look at the Indian Ocean. It is the third largest ocean on Earth, and it is not just any ocean. It carries 80% of the world's oil trade. It carries 30% of all global cargo. It is the highway of the modern global economy, and India sits at the center of it. That single geographic reality gives India something that no military campaign, no trade deal, and no diplomatic negotiation can replicate. It gives India natural oversight over the majority of the world's maritime trade. When goods move between East and West, they move through India's neighborhood. When oil travels from the Middle East to Asia, it moves through India's neighborhood. That is not a political achievement. That is geography. And it has been sitting there waiting to be used for as long as India has existed as a nation. But it gets more specific and more powerful. At the eastern end of the Indian Ocean sits a narrow waterway between the coasts of Malaysia and Indonesia. It is called the Strait of Malacca. At its narrowest point, it is only 2.8 kilometers wide. You could almost swim across it. And yet every single year, $3.5 trillion worth of global trade flows through that strip of water. More importantly, over 80% of China's total energy imports pass through this single choke point. Every tanker carrying fuel toward China, every cargo ship keeping China's factories running, every vessel delivering the raw materials that power the world's second largest economy passes through a gap that is less than 3 kilometers at its narrowest. This is China's single most dangerous geographic vulnerability, and India is positioned to do something about it. India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands sit just 90 nautical miles from the northern entrance of the Malacca Strait. 90 miles. That is nothing. For decades, India sat on this advantage without fully using it. Foreign ports collected hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue that could have been flowing into Indian hands. Then India woke up. India is now building an 81,000 crore project at the southern tip of the Nicobar Islands. It will be a full strategic city, a port capable of handling the largest container ships in the world, a naval base, a military airstrip, a garrison, a permanent, powerful Indian presence right next to one of the most important maritime choke points on the planet. When this project is complete, India will no longer be dependent on foreign ports for its strategic positioning in this region. It will generate an estimated 2,000 to 3,500 crore rupees annually in shipping revenue. It will create more than 50,000 jobs on Indian soil. And in the event of any serious conflict with China, India will not need to fire a single missile. It will only need to close the gates at Malacca. China's economy begins to suffocate. This is not aggression. This is geography. Used intelligently, used patiently, used the way great powers use their advantages. Beyond the Nicobar project, India has been quietly building what analysts call a necklace of diamonds, a network of access agreements, basing rights and logistics partnerships that surrounds China's ocean access from multiple directions. Each point in this network gives India refueling capability, surveillance range, and a permanent military presence across the Indian Ocean. All of this without declaring a single formal military alliance. India has been building its own chain of influence across the very waters that China depends upon. And then there are the Himalayas. To the north of India, stretching across thousands of kilometers, sits one of the most formidable natural barriers on Earth. The Himalayan mountain range functions as a natural military wall. Moving large-scale military forces across those mountains is not just difficult, it is virtually impossible in any meaningful strategic sense. A land invasion of India from China faces obstacles that even the most advanced military technology cannot easily overcome. India's geography creates a situation that is the foundation of all real power. India cannot easily be destroyed. And when a country cannot be destroyed, it can be negotiated with, it can be traded with, it can be relied upon. Because it will still be there tomorrow. That is where everything else begins. Wars are won and lost because of resources. Not just on the battlefield, but in every factory, every hospital, every kitchen, every home that has to keep functioning while the war is happening around it. You need resources to fight. You need resources to survive. You need resources to remain relevant to a world that is watching you. When most people think of strategic resources, they think of oil and gas, maybe coal, maybe rare earth minerals. And yes, India has all of those too. India holds the world's fifth largest coal reserves. It ranks among the top 5 global producers of steel, aluminum, and cement. It possesses the world's largest known deposits of thorium, the material that could fuel the next generation of nuclear reactors. The mineral belts across Rajasthan, Odisha, and Jharkhand supply iron ore, bauxite, chromite, and rare earth elements to industries across the globe. India is also the world's largest producer of milk, spices, pulses, and tea, the second largest producer of rice, wheat, sugarcane, cotton, and vegetables. When the world talks about food security in a crisis, India is one of the largest pieces of that puzzle. But then there is the resource that most people overlook, the one that, in a global health crisis or a world at war, becomes more valuable than almost anything else. Medicine. India supplies 20% of all generic medicines to 191 countries around the world. 40% of all the generic drugs consumed in the United States of America come from Indian factories. This is not a small thing. This is not an interesting footnote. If India were to stop pharmaceutical exports tomorrow, the entire global healthcare system would begin breaking down within weeks. Not months. Weeks. Hospitals across the world would run out of essential medications. Treatments would be interrupted. Lives would be endangered. The ripple effect would be catastrophic. That is leverage. That is the kind of resource power that most countries spend their entire existence trying to build and never achieve. But what India has constructed on top of this natural and agricultural and pharmaceutical foundation has taken its strategic position to an entirely different level. Since 2020, the world's major economies began realizing something uncomfortable. They had allowed themselves to become dangerously dependent on China for an extraordinary range of manufactured goods. When the pandemic exposed that vulnerability, governments and corporations began scrambling to find alternatives. They needed a country with the scale to absorb that manufacturing transition. They needed the workforce, the infrastructure, and the political stability to make it work. India stepped forward. Through a government initiative called Production-Linked Incentives, India created a system that rewarded manufacturers for producing on Indian soil. The more you produce in India, the more financial benefits you receive. Simple, direct, effective. It worked. In 2024 alone, India became the largest destination for greenfield digital investment in the entire world, attracting announcements of $114 billion in new projects. Apple began manufacturing iPhones in India. Samsung expanded its Indian operations massively. Google made India central to its hardware production strategy. Boeing began investing in Indian aerospace manufacturing. And here is the geopolitical reality that most people miss when they read those business headlines. When Apple manufactures in India, the American government cannot afford a bad relationship with India. When Samsung's supply chain runs through Indian factories, the South Korean government cannot afford to alienate India. When Boeing is building components in India, the relationship between New Delhi and Washington becomes something that American corporations will lobby to protect. Manufacturing dependency creates diplomatic dependency. India has turned its factory floor into a foreign policy instrument. And above all of this, the single most powerful resource India possesses is one that cannot be sanctioned, cannot be bombed, and cannot be replicated by any competitor within any reasonable time frame. Its people. India is the most populous nation on Earth. With over 1.4 billion people, 65% of whom are under the age of 35, India is one of the youngest countries in the world and will remain so until at least 2055. It is a $4 trillion economy projected to become the world's third largest by 2030. No global corporation can realistically ignore a consumer market of that scale and ambition. No trade deal can be structured without considering Indian access. No global supply chain can be designed without accounting for Indian labor, Indian talent, and Indian demand. That gives India a permanent, silent negotiating advantage in every single diplomatic and commercial conversation it enters. Before a word is spoken, the other side already needs India more than it can afford to admit. March 13th, 2026. Oil is trading above $100 per barrel. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively shut down by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. No Western tanker is attempting to make the crossing. No insurance company will cover the risk. American naval vessels are patrolling the outer edges of the strait, but not attempting to enter. The strait is, for all practical purposes, closed. And then something happens. An Indian flag gas carrier named Shivalik enters the strait. A second Indian vessel follows hours later. Iran's ambassador to India makes a statement. India was granted a safe corridor because, in his words, the two nations share a common fate. Think about what just happened. The most consequential maritime choke point on Earth, closed to every major power on the planet, open to India. The United States cannot call Iran without it becoming a political crisis. Israel cannot speak to Iran at all. Russia cannot engage with the Gulf states without being viewed through the lens of its alliance with Iran. China is seen across the Middle East as Pakistan's patron and as an adversary of Israel. Every major power is locked inside the alliances it chose. Those alliances are now at war with each other. Every great power is trapped in the corner it painted itself into. Not India. India is talking to everyone. This did not happen by accident. It is the result of a philosophy that has been deliberately and carefully constructed over the last 2 decades. Analysts call it strategic autonomy. Others call it dehyphenation. But the simplest way to describe it is this. India does what is best for India. Full stop. For years, India was described as non-aligned. The first Prime Minister of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru, built a foreign policy of neutrality around refusing to take sides in the Cold War. At the time, that made sense. India was a newly independent nation with a fragile economy, uncertain borders, and enormous internal challenges. Staying out of superpower conflicts was a survival strategy. But India is no longer that nation. The India of today, under the strategic vision of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has moved from non-alignment to what might be called multi-alignment. India is not neutral. India is actively engaged with all sides of every major global contest, but it is engaged entirely on India's own terms. When the United States pressured India to refuse Russia's S-400 missile defense system and threatened to impose sanctions, India bought the S-400 anyway. When the West imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, India began purchasing Russian crude oil at below-market prices, saving approximately $15 billion in the process. And then when Washington began pressuring India to stop buying Russian oil, India's policymakers made a different kind of decision. They recognized the danger. India was becoming too dependent on a single supplier. That dependency could become a vulnerability. So India diversified its energy supply across more than 40 countries spanning 4 continents, reducing Russian oil as a share of Indian imports from over 40% down to 21.2% by January 2026. Then the Iran war exploded. Global energy markets shattered. Prices broke through $100 per barrel. And quietly, Washington came back to India with a request that would have seemed almost unthinkable just a year earlier. Please start buying Russian oil again. The world needs prices to come down. The country that had told India not to buy Russian oil was now asking India to buy Russian oil. That is the pattern. That is what India has built. Every major player in this conflict is approaching India with something to offer because every major player needs something from India. America needs India's market size and its moderating influence on Russia. Russia needs India as its primary weapons customer and its largest oil buyer outside of China. China needs India's cooperation in multilateral forums, even as the two nations compete fiercely across the Indian Ocean region. The Gulf states need India's pharmaceutical lifeline, its skilled workforce, and the 35 million Indians who live and work across the Arabian Peninsula. India sits inside every competing global bloc at the same time. India is part of the Quad alongside the United States, Australia, and Japan. India is part of BRICS alongside China and Russia. India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization alongside China and Pakistan. India stands as the democratic anchor of the global South at the G20. If the United States punishes India, the Quad loses its most important Asian partner and collapses in strategic terms. If China punishes India, BRICS loses the voice that gives it credibility with the developing world. If Russia punishes India, it loses its largest arms buyer and its most important oil customer outside of the Western sanctions regime. India has made itself impossible to isolate. This is not luck. This is not the result of some fortunate coincidence of history. This is 20 years of refusing to be owned, 20 years of saying yes to relationships and no to dependency, 20 years of deliberate, calculated, patient construction. And on March 13, 2026, when an Indian ship sailed through a strait that was closed to everyone else in the world, the entire architecture of those 20 years became visible for the world to see. On the night the U.S. struck Iran, Narendra Modi made 8 phone calls. He called Israel, then Iran, then the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait. Both sides of an active war in one night. Most world leaders cannot do that. The U.S. cannot call Iran without it becoming a crisis. Israel cannot call Iran at all. Russia is distrusted across the Gulf. China is seen as taking sides. Every major power is stuck inside the choices it already made. India is not stuck. India can call everyone, because India has never been owned by anyone. But that trust took decades to build. Here is how India built it. During COVID, India gave away 300 million vaccine doses to over 100 countries before its own 1.4 billion people were fully vaccinated. Half of all medicines used across Africa come from Indian factories. When Sri Lanka's economy collapsed in 2022, India sent $4 billion in emergency aid. When Nepal needed energy, India built the infrastructure and helped Nepal earn an estimated $16 billion in returns. And India never used any of this as leverage. It helped, and it left. That is why India now leads a coalition of 80-plus nations across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, a bloc larger in UN voting weight than all of NATO. Geography, resources, strategy, relationships. When all 4 work together, you become the country that nobody can ignore, replace, or punish. One point that's usually never discussed in videos like this is just how deeply India has already embedded itself into the structures of global power, not through force, but through people, infrastructure, and quiet influence. 32 million Indians live outside India. They work in governments, companies, and universities all over the world. Every year, they send home $135 billion more than any other country receives. But let us be honest about something, because this story, as extraordinary as it is not without its weight. Two nuclear-armed power blocs are actively at war around India right now. Not hypothetically, not in some future scenario, right now. And India has to navigate that reality every single day while maintaining the trust of both sides. The moment India makes a clear, definitive move toward either bloc, the safe corridor closes. The phone calls stop coming. The strategic value that India has built across decades of careful cultivation disappears. India is not trapped by this war in the way that other nations are trapped. But India is constrained by it in a different and perhaps more demanding way. India is constrained by the necessity of its own usefulness, constrained by the requirement to keep every relationship functional, every line of communication open, every door available to walk through. That is not weakness. Please understand that clearly. That is not weakness. That is the price of being the only nation on earth that every other nation needs. The world is changing, fast, and India is right at the center of it. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead, because this is just the beginning.